Hi, and welcome back to Marketplace Tech's limited series, Decoding Democracy. I'm your host, Kimberly Adams. Today, we'll be exploring the barriers faced by disabled Americans when they're trying to vote in this election and how technology has been changing that. Joining me to help is Michelle Bishop, Voter Access and Engagement Manager at the National Disability Rights Network. Michelle, welcome to the program.
Hi, Kimberly. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excited to have you. How does the experience of voting in a general election like this one differ for people with disabilities compared to everyone else?
That's a great question because we talk about this a lot and people say, where are kind of the barriers for voting for people with disabilities? And unfortunately, the answer is sort of everywhere in the process. If you look at any touch point that a voter has with the system, we traditionally see some barriers, even from getting registered to vote. Traditionally, that is done by filling out a piece of paper, which, if you are blind or you don't have use of your hands, is something you can't do independently. We've made that much better by adding like online voter registration in most states. But if we don't design those portals to be accessible for things like screen readers, they don't work for people with disabilities. It opens up the system for everybody but people with certain types of disabilities. Traditionally, polling places, in-person voting, when you think of going down the street to your polling place and casting your ballot, not all of those locations comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Once again, I can remember voting on the punch card systems where you have to hold like a little thumbtack and like punch a little hole out. It just doesn't work for a lot of people, actually. And now we have some more like touchscreen systems that mark your ballot for you that are significantly more accessible, although still not perfect. We're not quite there. When you think about vote by mail systems, that's once again traditionally exactly what it sounds like, being mailed a piece of paper that you have to be able to handle, you have to be able to read it, you have to be able to mark it. Even when we think about preparing to vote, if you go to your elections website for your state or your county and it hasn't been designed so that it's accessible for people with disabilities, it's harder to find where's my polling place? Is that accessible to me? What's going to be on my ballot? So we find that at every point in the system, if we haven't designed it well with every type of voter in mind, it introduces some barriers for people with disabilities.
There are a lot of concerns, especially amongst people who think that maybe the elections are not secure, even though historically they have been, that these expanded ways to access voting could make elections more vulnerable. How do you talk to people about that?
I think there's a couple components there. One is kind of separating out real conversations about making sure our elections are secure from some of the tactics that are being used to divide us right now and break down our confidence in elections that are not founded, coming out of particularly the 2020 election. But when we talk about making sure our elections are secure, I think we do want to be careful with technology. But what we talk about is that there's really a balance here, right? We want to be careful and deliberate in the way that we embrace technology to make sure we're making it as secure as possible. But it is still a thing that we have to do. We can't really leave technology out of the process because if we do, we really risk disenfranchising people with disabilities. And this is something that we have really, a way of thinking I think we've really adopted for other types of voters, like military and overseas voters. They can get their absentee ballots electronically, mark them that way, a lot of times even return them that way. Because if we know we don't have that option for military and overseas voters, they might be completely disenfranchised, right? We send our military to far-flung places where they can't get mail, and we have to make sure they're able to have their voices heard. We're willing to take a certain amount of calculated risk in order to make sure that certain folks aren't disenfranchised. And we could do the same thing for people with disabilities. The systems that benefit our military and overseas voters would also benefit people with disabilities stateside by taking some of the paper out of the process, making it electronic and making it more accessible. And there's always going to be calculated risks in the system. There's not any type of voting system, even if we think of the old school pen to paper and people counting it by hand, that's completely secure. So we just have to know where the risks are and protect ourselves against those vulnerabilities, but make sure we're not doing it in a way where we're disenfranchising some of our voters.
During the 2020 election, when the COVID lockdowns were in place, we saw a big expansion of voter access with a lot of new ways for all voters, including disabled voters, to get involved in the election. What's happened since then, and how many of those things are still in place?
In the 2020 election, we really had to rethink how voters interact with the system, because that traditional model of going down the street to your polling place and waiting in a line 6 feet apart and then being in a really crowded polling place wasn't going to work when we were trying to protect ourselves from COVID. As exciting as it is, and as much as I bet a lot of people love it as much as I do, I love to go and get my sticker and then show off my sticker to everyone all day because I'm really proud that I voted. But I'm pretty nerdy about that stuff. That might just be me. But we really had to think about new ways of voting. So we focused on things that made it possible for people to space out, extending our early voting or adding early voting in places where we didn't have it, letting people vote curbside or drive through. So especially people who are immunocompromised could stay in their vehicles. But really the rock star of 2020 was voting by mail. I mean, that was really the thing that was going to make it so that you could socially distance the most and not really interact with any crowded polling places. But when we think about vote by mail, traditionally, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's mailing someone a piece of paper. And for so many people with print disabilities, if you're blind or low vision, you have a learning disability, you have limited or no use of your hands, paper is the thing that just makes it inaccessible. So we really focused on taking the systems that military and overseas voters use that are already in place in the States and opening them up to people with disabilities so that they could receive that ballot electronically, mark it electronically, and in some places actually even return it electronically, which really makes it as accessible as possible. Sometimes you still have to print it and mail it back, which makes the process of receiving and marking it really accessible, but returning it, then once again, you can't do it fully independently. So it's a step forward, but not as far as we'd like. We want that to be a fully independent process, but we really embraced those a lot more, and it made a big difference. And since 2020, it's been a little bit of a mixed bag. We've seen some states that have said, all these things that we did were great. This is the most accessible election we've ever had. Let's make this permanent. Let's keep this going. We've seen some states where there's been a lot of pushback. They don't want to continue to use some of those methods. And then honestly, there's a lot of states that are doing a bit of both. And they're taking some changes and making them permanent, and they're rolling some back. So it's an atmosphere where I think we know the way forward. I think we know what's going to make it most accessible for voters with disabilities and all voters. But we're seeing a lot of movement back and forth that I think not only holds us back from really embracing good technologies, but also is just going to confuse our voters. So hopefully going into 2024, I just hope that voters are making their plan to vote ahead of time, and they know what their options are going to be where they are, and they're ready to vote. Nobody should miss their chance to vote this November.
There are some valid concerns that experts have raised about security of some of these electronic voting machines. And then there are also some disabled folks who physically need help to cast their ballots. How do we avoid those real risks being fed into misinformation narratives around the security of our election?
Absolutely. I think the thing that we really need to do is separate out really important discourse that's happening around the balance that we strike around how much of a security risk are we taking here to make sure that certain people aren't disenfranchised versus some of the narratives that are being pushed that are not based in fact and that are being used to divide us and to break down confidence in our elections. And I think we really have to be able to separate the two and set one aside and say we're not going to fall for that and we're not going to argue with each other over fears and concerns that are not real and that are being used to justify a narrative that's being pushed around an election that was accurate and fair and has already been settled. And we're going to focus on what's real. I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I'm not a computer scientist, but the folks I know who do that say we do have some security concerns around sending ballots electronically, sending completed ballots back electronically. I can understand that, and I think that's important. I think voters with disabilities would agree they want their ballots to be secure. So what we're really talking about is striking a balance. Let's take people with print disabilities who maybe need this most to not be disenfranchised and let them use it the same way we let our overseas military use it to make sure they're not disenfranchised. We don't have to say internet voting for everyone right now if we're not ready to secure it. I think it would be awesome if we felt really confident we could secure it. Maybe it would boost our participation numbers. But if we're not ready to do that today, we don't have to. But we can take a little bit of a calculated risk to open it up for the folks who need it most to make sure everyone's able to cast their ballots.
Michelle Bishop is Voter Access and Engagement Manager at the National Disability Rights Network. Michelle, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode of Decoding Democracy. If you have any stories you'd like to share about voting in this election, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below. And if you've enjoyed this show or this series, please like and subscribe. Daniel Shin produced this episode. I'm Kimberly Adams.